Hello, welcome to another session of just looking at the Bible together, exploring the Bible together, reading the Bible together as we're going through Philippians. And we're just trying to take a bit of encouragement from the Bible as we look at Philippians together. Today, we're going to continue with Philippians 2. It's going to be Philippians 2, verses 12 to 18. So I'll just read this to you. Therefore, my dear friends, as you have always obeyed, not only in my presence, but now much more in my absence, continue to work out your salvation with fear and trembling. For it is God who works in you to will and to act in order to fulfill his good purpose. Do everything without grumbling or arguing, so that you may become blameless and pure, children of God without fault in a warped and crooked generation. Then you will shine among them like stars in the sky, and as you hold firmly to the word of life. And then I will be able to boast on the day of Christ that I did not run or labor in vain. But even if I am being poured out like a drink offering on the sacrifice and serving coming from your faith, I am glad and rejoice with all of you. So you too should be glad and rejoice with me. Again, I know I've said this every week, and I'm going to continue to say it. This isn't a deep theological unpicking of it. These are just what was jumped out at me, my thoughts as reading this, to almost give us some direction or some thoughts to dwell on, really. It must be remembered, as I've said week after week after week, Paul was in prison when he wrote this, and that context, I think, gives us a lot more scope when we look at what it says. First of all, verses 12 and 13. God is at work in each of us in order to fulfill God's good purposes in our lives. Do our circumstances stop God from doing this work in us? No. God was doing a work in Paul and through Paul when Paul was in prison. God was doing in work and working through the Philippians in their situations they will find themselves. The situation does not determine whether God can be at work in us. He promises to be at work in us and through us to fulfill his good purposes. Those purposes are in every situation and every circumstance. So Paul was in prison, cut off, isolated, if you want to use that language, from the outside world. Yet, God was still at work in Paul, and God was still working through Paul to impact other people. The coronavirus does not stop God from doing his work in us. The coronavirus does not stop the promises of God being worked out in our lives, and doesn't stop the work of God happening through us as we look at how we connect and reach out to each other. God's work is God's work, and nothing will stop it. Didn't stop God working in and through Paul in prison, and it will not stop working through us, even in self-isolation and lockdown. Or if you're a key worker and you've been working harder than ever before, God can still be at work in you. Are you looking for it? Are you digging into it? Are you running after it? Because the truth is, God will complete the works in us to fulfill his good purposes, regardless of our situations. And for me, that gives me not only great encouragement, it encourages me to keep reaching, to keep connecting, to keep speaking, to not stick my head in the sand. It keeps encouraging me that God is greater than this, that nothing can stop him, and God still has a plan for my life, even in the midst of lockdown. What else? I think this is a really challenging one. Paul says to us, do everything without grumbling or arguing. If I was Paul and I was in prison because I'd shared my faith, I think I would have a reason to grumble. The injustice that I would feel from being imprisoned, from simply sharing my faith, I think I'd grumble a little bit, being honest. But Paul doesn't. Not only does he not grumble, but from his prison cell, of which he has every right to be grumbling about, he doesn't grumble. He still gives thanks, and he encourages. In fact, he doesn't just encourage, he implores each of us not to grumble. If anyone had a reason to grumble, it was Paul. And not only does he not grumble, but he encourages us not to. And what happens when we don't grumble when we could? Then you will shine among them like stars in the sky. When we have reasons to grumble and we don't, our lives shine with the light of God. I think we all have a lot of reasons to grumble right now. Justifiably so, just like Paul did. We can either choose to do that and give in to that grumbling and be part of that grumbling, or we can choose to follow what Paul says here, and in the midst of being justified in grumbling, refusing to grumble, to still be rejoicing and giving thanks and plugging into God instead of grumbling. And what happens when we do that? Our lives will shine like stars in the sky, shining with the light of the love of God. Other people will see it. If you had a candle in this room right now, it wouldn't look very bright. If you have a candle in a dark room, it stands out and it shines. Right now, there is so much, because there's so many reasons to grumble, there is so much grumbling and discontent and worry and concern and doubt. There is so much of that out there. And we could be part of that. We could be another voice in that. Or we could be not doing it. We could be the voice of light. We could not be grumbling. We could not be arguing. We could not be giving into those words and speaking light and love and life continually. And then suddenly what was a darker place is less dark because of what God's done in and through us and what's coming out of our mouths. The world becomes less dull, less dark, becomes brighter with the light of God. Why? Because we're choosing to not grumble. We're choosing to not speak into those arguments and those doubts and those concerns. But we're speaking life. And where we speak life and encouragement, our lives will shine with the light of God. It almost seems too simple, but actually it's true. But then it really puts the onus on us not to grumble. Reminding ourselves that Paul was imprisoned simply for sharing his faith. He had every reason to grumble, but didn't. And he encourages us not to. Why? Because the light of God, the love of God, is more important than anything that we're grumbling about. We need to have that perspective. And actually, what do I do when I find myself grumbling? Talked about it on Sunday. I run after God. I focus on God the Almighty in Psalm 93. I focus on God being my refuge and my strength from Psalm 46. I focus on God being my healer from Exodus. I rely on the love of God to get me through. I look at God being the provider, and yes, there's Genesis, but there's so many more examples. I listen to my brothers and sisters in Christ, other people in the church, because they're seeing God the healer, the provider, the Almighty. And that stops me from grumbling. Running after God leads me away from a grumbling heart. And then finally, what does Paul do? He says, if you can hold on to this, if you can do this, then rejoice and be glad, because all this stuff we go through won't have been wasted. Won't have been wasted. We have so many reasons to be glad because of God and what God is doing in us and through us. And when we rejoice and when we show that gladness, even when we've got so much to grumble about, our lives shine the light of God even more. And when we speak out that rejoicing and that gladness, something happens in our soul as well. Paul could do this from prison. We can do this in lockdown. Let's be encouraged by Paul, and let's follow his example, knowing that God is greater than anything this world can throw at us. I really hope you have a great week. Stay safe, look after yourself, wash your hands, follow the social distancing guidelines, and I cannot wait to see you more in person soon.